This interview with Reef Nutrition is brought to you by Humble Fish and Reef. Okay, everybody. We have Chad here from Reef Nutrition, and I'm going to be interviewing him today. Hi, Chad. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So I guess the first thing is just basically to tell us about the company. You know, there may be some reefers, some new hobbyists that are not familiar with Reef Nutrition. So just tell us about the company.
All right. So yes, my name is Chad Clayton, and I am part of the live feeds operation. I also work in research and development of new products. I tend to do a lot of our social media and trade shows and club presentations and interviews like this. So I'm kind of the face of the brand, and also am very much involved with the products that we produce. So Reef Nutrition is a brand under a company called Reed Mariculture. We're located in Silicon Valley, California, in the San Jose area, so just south of San Francisco, for those of you that aren't familiar with the area. We have been producing marine phytoplankton, so algae, since the late 90s. We are a very large-scale phytoplankton facility. You could call it a commercial grade facility. We're very unique in the world with what we do. I'd say about 16 years ago, we were approached by hobbyists that had non-photosynthetic corals and some of these other more difficult to keep bivalves, clams and scallops and things like that. And they approached us because they had heard about us producing microalgae and selling algae into aquaculture, because that's primarily what we do. The majority of our business is dedicated to selling algae to people that don't want to grow it or don't have the capacity to grow enough, or they have seasonality issues, or they experience intermittent contamination problems. So they buy the algae from us instead of going through all that process of setting up growing facilities, hiring staff to take care of the algae, growing the correct species, and having it there reliably all the time. So most of our customers buy our algae to feed to, let's say you're an oyster farmer and you have oysters that are spawning and you want to raise the oysters and you don't want to do this, in an open ocean or coastal area. You want to do it indoors, let's say in recirculating aquaculture systems. So these oyster hatcheries will buy our algae, they'll feed the algae to their broodstock. The broodstock spawn, they release eggs, the eggs hatch, become larval oysters, which are very small, and they're really cool videos online. You can see oysters developing online, and they feed the algae to the baby, the larval oysters, and then they grow from there, put on their shell, they set onto a substrate, and then from there, they grow them out, and then they sell them to, market. So a restaurant or a Whole Foods style supermarket, things like that. So we're very much involved in kind of the food, agriculture, kind of aquaculture industry when it comes to those kinds of things. And we sell algae to shrimp farms and clam farms and fish farms, because they're feeding the algae to very small animals that are then fed to the fish larvae and so on. So we have this algae product, and these aquarium hobbyists came to us early on in 2000 and said, is there anything you can do? Can you provide us with a blend of phytoplankton, very concentrated, something that's stable? And so we came out with a product called Phyto Feast, which was our flagship product, and many people are familiar with us with that product. And that's a blend of 6 different species of phytoplankton that we grow ourselves at our facility. It's incredibly concentrated and very diverse, and is a great diet for a number of invertebrate organisms. And we can get into that in a little bit. And from there, the people like that product. They said, give us more. And so we decided to get into other food types, oyster eggs, fish eggs. We also had all this algae, so we figured, let's grow some live feed organisms. Let's grow rotifers. Let's grow copepods. Let's be a source for those animals, like we are for the algae. So let's say a fish hatchery it needs rotifers. They're feeding them to larval fish. For example, let's say you're a clownfish breeder and you need a live feed organism for your clownfish larvae. Rotifers are a great first live feed organism for those animals. And so we grow a lot of rotifers. We feed them with our own algae and enrichments. And we are always, we tend to have a large supply of these rotifers on hand at any given time, because we sell live rotifers to people growing clownfish, to people growing cod, to people growing zebra danios, the freshwater fish that are used in research, and also you see them in home aquariums. And so we tend to have about 3 billion rotifers on hand at any given time. It's probably hard for people to understand what that means. And rotifers are they're like a quarter of a millimeter in length, the ones that we work with. So you can get an idea of their size, and we have them packed in pretty tight. Because we have all this algae, we can grow these things at high density and have them available fairly consistently. We do have issues sometimes where demand goes through the roof, and our rotifer culture get wiped out. So we have to slow down and kind of mete out what we have to people while we're bolstering up our populations. And so also we grow copepods. We have 3 different species, one of which is highly prized in marine ornamental aquaculture, and is the same one that's used by people grow it culturing yellow tangs and hippo tangs, and these fish that have very small larvae. These larvae have very small mouths, and they require a very small live feed organism. And copepods have an incredibly good nutritional profile. They have a great composition of fatty acids and vitamins, and proteins. And so these things get passed on to these larval fish, and these fish, grow and go through metamorphosis, and then they look like, their adult version eventually, and then they make it to the aquarium trade. So we're very much a part of aquaculture globally and domestically. There are a lot of industries globally that exist because of us, because of the amount of phytoplankton that we can produce and supply. Because without it, some of these companies wouldn't exist. They wouldn't even bother growing microalgae. And so where we're at today is we're a 1.5 million gallon phytoplankton farm. We also have a number of zooplankton. We have very strict biosecurity rules to prevent contamination and things that can cause problems with our cultures. Everything is compartmentalized, and we have I think we're roughly at 20 employees, and I'd say half of those are involved in growing the algae, the day-to-day operations, and then the rest of us are kind of administration, customer service, operations, running the show. And so that's kind of where Reef Nutrition comes from. And not only do we have liquid suspension feeds that are refrigerated, that's basically how we keep them stable. Instead of using a lot of preservatives, refrigeration is a form of preservative. And the liquid suspension aspect of our foods is something that people very much enjoy. They also like the fact that our cells, with the phytoplankton and the eggs with the oyster feast and the fish eggs, and then the copepods and mysis and brine shrimp, these things that we carry, are fully intact in liquid suspension. They're not dried out or ground up and combined into some other powdered form. They're what we call wild type whole organism food. And we also have our TDO, which is a dry food, and we can talk more about that in a little bit. And that one's is great in aquaculture as well as the hobby. So I've been with the company for 13 years and brought a lot of knowledge from aquaculture and culturing marine organisms and food fish species and working with live feeds. So it's been quite a journey so far with reed mariculture. And I tell you what, this pandemic, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's very bad and it's bad for a lot of people, but for our business, for the hobby, a lot of people that were locked down, weren't able to travel, they put a lot of money into their aquariums and into their hobby, and also started trying to breed some clownfish in their house, and we saw a huge uptick in demand. So it's I mean, for the most part, the pandemic has been quite interesting for us, for sure. It hasn't burdened us at all, I would say. But the supply chain has been somewhat challenging, finding things when you need them. So yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
So it sounds like and correct me if I'm wrong, this is a company, everything's made in the USA.
So most of the stuff that we work with is made in the USA. The TDO, the pelleted food that we use to make TDO, we get from Japan.
Okay.
a fish food manufacturer in Japan that sells one of the foods is called otohime. And this food is sold throughout the globe into food fish aquaculture, and we're the North American distributor, and we take this food and we top dress it with Haematococcus, which is rich in the carotenoid astaxanthin, and so that one is from Japan. The fish eggs are from Scandinavia, and I think, and the brine shrimp are from Western Australia. They're aquacultured in Western Australia. So
Okay.
algae and the pods, the rotifers, all that, the tiger pods, all that, we do ourselves in-house.
That's awesome. Because, nowadays people are looking for companies, made in the USA to support, if you're in the USA, and it sounds like your company it's an amazing company to support, especially for the USA. So,
absolutely.
So let's talk about corals, because you talked about the phytoplankton. It sounds like that would be great for filter feeders like oysters and, well, in an aquarium, and ornamental mussels, and especially clams. A lot of people struggle, especially like maxima clams, to keep those in captivity. But what about corals? Like, let's say we'll start with LPS corals. What would be a good product that you sell for those that want to supplement feed their LPS corals?
Right. I would say our top product for virtually any coral, any filter feeding invertebrate, down to some sponges and tunicates, things like that. Our Oyster Feast is by far our best product for those animals, for the vast majority of those animals. Oyster Feast are oyster eggs and ovarian tissue, and so the particle range is from 1 to 200 micron, and the majority of that is like 1 to 50 micron, very small particle range. So, easily consumed by an SPS coral like an Acropora, Seriatopora, these animals with very small mouths and polyps. LPS have no problem consuming this food. And the oyster eggs are just full of things like fatty acids and lipids and vitamins, and things that help animals, like vitamins that help animals digest foods, accumulate fats, good fats. There are sterols in there. There are amino acids floating around in that product that are very stimulating to corals. This is one of the biggest things that people tell us that they like about Oyster Feast is they can actually visibly see the polyp extension, feeder tentacles coming out. These animals, these colonies, are in full feed mode. As soon as this stuff hits the water and they start picking up on it, they start filling up, their hydrostatic membranes start filling up, and they start consuming this. And so that one, I would say, is by far our top food. And then I would also say with LPS corals, a lot of people will target feed our fish eggs to those corals as well. So the product that we call roe.
So would oyster and roe, would that also be good for NPS, like Oregonians?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Oregonians absolutely will consume those. And for NPS corals, a lot of people will mix in the phytoplankton. NPS corals will absolutely consume phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton that we sell in our Phyto Feast or our shellfish diet are in that very small range. Nanochloropsis, which is a green phytoplankton that we grow, it's our primary algae that we work with, is roughly 1 to 2 micron. And for those of you that don't understand size, it's much smaller than a blood cell, let's say, much smaller than that. And these animals have no problem, grabbing onto that phytoplankton cell or the oyster egg and digesting it. And one thing to note with the phytoplankton is that these animals, they're opportunistic, and they do not care if that is alive or not. Just like they don't care that the oyster egg is a viable oyster egg and is going to hatch into an oyster larvae. It's not alive, but they recognize it as a food source, and they digest it, and they get that nutrition from it. And so that helps to kind of answer the question about why, live phytoplankton versus dead phytoplankton. And that's primarily what we sell is dead phytoplankton. And this is what people are feeding to these delicate organisms and to NPS corals and ridgeback clams and flame scallops, or whatever, we call them, and tridacnyds, things like that. So So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that these animals, as long as that cell is fully intact, which is what we make sure it is, it's not, it's not leaking, it's not damaged, it's not lysing, breaking apart. That all that nutrition inside that cell, that algal cell, and algae are primary producers. They produce things that animals don't, like fatty acids and certain vitamins and minerals. All that nutrition goes right into that animal, and they accumulate what they can, and their rest comes out as waste, and then we export it with our waste export devices.
That's awesome. That provides listeners with, because you're always looking for a way to supplement, feed your corals to everybody wants them to grow faster. They want the colors to be better. So those sounds like great products for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I noticed on your website that you have it's kind of like a pod pack that you sell, for seeding, we'll say a new tank with copepods. So if someone were to buy that pod pack and they had plans on buying a mandarin down the road, how long should they wait after dosing those 3 products before adding a mandarin until, give time for the copepods to propagate?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and there are a number of ways to look at it. It depends on. So if we're talking about, let's say you're setting up a brand new tank and you want to seed the tank, as we say, or inoculate the tank with live feed organisms, especially if you're buying, reef rock that's just dead and or artificial. It comes with nothing, whereas live rock comes with a lot of critters. And actually live rock is very good in many ways. It has beneficial bacteria that are already on there in good populations. So live rock can be very good to start a tank. But what I tend to tell people is once you start seeing things like diatoms growing in the tank, what we call the ugly phase, especially if you're just letting these things come about naturally, you're not trying to, I know people will also put bacteria in a tank to speed up that whole, bacteria population and nitrogen cycle thing. And that's fine. But as long as you're not adding things that are killing algae and killing the phytoplankton that naturally occurs and comes along when you're building this miniature ecosystem, that tends to be a good time to start adding some pods. And the reason why we say that is that, so the copepods that we work with, the ones that we sell to people to seed a tank, their primary diet in the wild are diatoms, and diatoms are very common in aquariums. They're always there. Once you get an aquarium set up, they get in there and they're in there forever. And their populations, they can bloom suddenly. And you see that the brown coloration in the glass and the substrate and rocks and things like that. That's most likely diatoms that are causing that. And that's a great source of food for them. And also, once the tank gets to that age, you've got some organic material that's kind of building up in the system. It's building up in the rock and the substrate. And that also is a good source of nutrition for the copepods. So that's primarily a good time to add them. It also helps to add them before you add any pod predators for sure. And so, you don't want to have wrasses and mandarins in a tank that you're trying to, get a population of copepods going in. And I usually tell people, be super patient when thinking about adding a mandarin dragonette. They're voracious predators when it comes to consuming zooplankton. They'll eat copepods, isopods, amphipods, all these pods that we talk about in the industry. And they can be quite ravenous when it comes to those food items, those live prey items. So I'd say give it at least 6 months to allow those copepods to get settled in, to get through a couple of generations, and really bump up their population size. And you'll see them, you'll see them on the glass. Some people, if you have a refugium or a sump that has substrate and habitat in it, you can use flashlights and find these animals. Most times that's a good way to detect them. And the other thing about mandarins is I recommend a large tank. If you're going to have them in a small tank, you're going to have to either culture your own copepods or get ready to routinely purchase them from your local fish store, or if you don't have one that carries them online, because a tank smaller than, let's say, 50 gallons is you're just asking for a situation where a mandarin's going to be starving if you're not on top of these things. So that's typically what I recommend. Is the larger the tank, the more habitat for these copepods to invade, so to speak, the better off that animal's going to be. And the other cool thing about mandarins, especially the captive bred ones, like the ones coming from biota. Yeah, so I was saying the mandarins, captive bred mandarins are, they're coming out of fish farms, and they're already, used to eating dead things. And in fact, some of these companies, they use our TDO to feed to mandarins, to wean them off of live feed organisms. They're also using things like frozen copepods and fish eggs and mysis, dead mysis, things like that. So those are really good animals to think about if you're going to get a mandarin versus a wild caught mandarin. And also you're avoiding the issues of I guess the fishing techniques that people use. Sometimes people are catching mandarins with cyanide, and the mandarin's immune system and maybe a lot of other things are disrupted in their bodies, and they get through the supply chain, they get to you, they look really emaciated, they might be eating copepods, but they might have infections or internal parasites, all these things that can just come along with them, and you're not really getting that from a fish farm, and so those are things to consider.
Yeah, I recommend, I tell people on my forum, it's really good to have a refugium attached to your tank in the sump or whatever. So that way you give the pods somewhere to reproduce without constantly being eaten. I think that's important because I think I read somewhere, and this may be an exaggeration, that a large male mandarin can eat up to 1,000 pods per day.
Easily more than that, easily.
Okay, more than that even.
I quarantined a mandarin about 10 years ago for our office tank, and I was feeding it an entire bottle of our tigerpods every day.
Wow.
3,000 copepods, and this was just in a quarantine tank with no habitat, and so it was easy to the mandarin just hunted everything down and ate it really easily. And in an aquarium, it's a little bit more challenging for them to hunt these things down, just so everybody knows that. But yeah, I was absolutely blown away when I saw that. I mean, you talk about constant hunting and foraging, and like how tangs on the reef. I used to live in Hawaii, and I would watch yellow tangs just constantly feeding off the reef rock, and consuming algae and things like that. And so I was just like, these animals can consume way more than you can imagine. And people with a nice big fat bodied girthy mandarin, that's a healthy animal that's eating a lot of pods, and you've got a tank that's supporting that. So that's good stuff. And I've seen those out there where people are really taking good care of these animals.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind though for people that try to keep a mandarin in a smaller aquarium. And just like we say, a healthy mandarin can eat let's say between 1,000 and 3,000 pods per day. And you have to imagine, like say in a 40 breed, or even the limited rock work you have for the copepods to live and propagate and all the rest of it. I just feel like you need at least a 75 gallon to even have a chance with a single specimen. I mean, I had a mated pair in a 150 gallon, and I was dosing pods constantly for them. I couldn't keep them, fed well enough.
Nice. Yeah, I got a mandarin from biota. I think it was a year and a half ago, and it came. It was tiny. But luckily, we have a 55 gallon, and there's a spot in the tank that's kind of where the current doesn't really affect the tank, or things settle, and it's a low current area. And so when we feed the TDO, we would feed them like the B2 and the C1, the very small granulated TDO. Some of it would make its way to that portion of the tank, and the mandarin would just sit right there and munch on the TDO and then go back to foraging. So that was cool to see it doing that. And they'll eat dry food. It's just amazing.
That is amazing. Well, so speaking of mandarins, and this comes into just not manakins, but other finicky species, copperband butterflies, Moorish idols, things like that. Because one of the things that I commonly encounter, a lot of people on my forum quarantine, and they put a fish in quarantine, and new fish doesn't want to eat. especially if it's a finicky species, like it could be a mandarin, could be a copper band butterfly. So I've had some success. I've used some of your products, the Oyster Feast. I've had success getting finicky species to eat that. The roe was another one. So what other foods do you all sell that you could recommend for someone that's got a fish in quarantine or even in their display tank that doesn't want to eat?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend our roe, which for those of you that don't know that product, it's they're fish eggs. They're cod eggs that we get from the cod fishery up in Alaska. And when it comes to, fish diet, if you see fish on a reef, and they're spawning, you 9 times out of 10, you're seeing other fish just going crazy, eating those eggs up, that, from those spawning fish. And so it's something that fish recognize as a food source. And eggs are really good. They're full of, proteins and vitamins. They can really help the animals start to process foods and metabolize foods and get some fat into their bodies. And then from there, you can get them to eat other things. So by far, our best product for getting finicky fish to eat would be the roe. And then there's some people that will also take the Oyster Feast, which is also very stimulating to fish. And they'll use that as well to kind of stimulate the fish into getting into somewhat of a feed mindset. And some people will soak our TDO pellets in Oyster Feast and make that dry food a little bit more stimulating, and they'll get finicky fish to eat that way. But we also have a lot of fish importers that use TDO in-house to get those fish onto a dry food, because TDO in and of itself is very stimulating when it comes to that smell. There's krill in TDO and fish oil. The Haematococcus, the astaxanthin, also gives off an interesting taste to these animals, and so that dry food also is used by a lot of people working with fish that are bringing them in, or fish stores bringing them in to get them to eat a dry food. So yeah, but roe, by far, roe is good, great success. A lot of people get anthias. A lot of anthias can be very finicky, and people will use the roe for anthias as well.
Okay. So roe and Ocean Feast would be, Oyster Feast, I'm sorry, would be the go-tos. So you talked about the TDO, the Chroma Boost, and I mean, that is really considered the best pellets out there. I mean, that is what everyone says. I mean, I've used them before. It's an excellent product. What makes them so good?
Well, it's like I was telling you before, that company in Japan that we buy it from, which it's called Otohime. They've been doing this for a long time. They went to fish hatcheries and tried to figure out what is the best composition of, marine ingredients. And, and they also use terrestrial ingredients. They also use things like starch, potato starch and nutritive, flour and things that are kind of binding agents. And they just developed this fantastic weaning diet, and it comes in very small size. So it comes in like 75 to 250 micron, which is roughly the size of a rotifer. And then from there, it comes in larger and larger sizes. And this food was primarily designed for fish hatcheries. So let's say you're breeding flounder, you're growing flounder in Turkey, and you got baby flounder, you got them on live feed organisms, and you want to get them off of that, you're going to use this powdered Otohime diet to get them on to dry food. And then from there, their growth just goes through the roof. I've used this stuff on Ceriola, which is a genus of a jack species that is a very good fish for restaurants, and the Japanese restaurants, they really like this in part of sashimi and sushi. And they sell these fish whole to Whole Foods and places like that. And once we were working with once we got Otohime and started weaning our fish off of live feeds onto that, their growth went through the roof. And so it just has, it's got just a really good proportion and a variety of nutritional different, types. And also the pellet and the granule, they're built well. They're put together nicely. They don't dissolve. They don't give off any weird kind of oils and things like that. It doesn't break apart, in a minute. And it's also digestible. There's a lot, a lot of it, most of it, when a fish consumes it, it gets digested. It doesn't really, it doesn't really go to waste. A lot of it doesn't just pass through and go into your skimmer, and so these are really good qualities of dry food that people rely on in fish aquaculture, because think about it, you're putting all this money into breeding flounder and hatching their eggs and raising them, all the life feed organisms you got to put into there, all the work that it takes to get that animal to the point where you're weaning it onto a dry food. You're darn tootin', you want to make sure that dry food is of high quality, and also of a food that gets converted into mass, into muscle and into tissue, and grows that fish as fast as possible so you can get it to market and get it out of your hatchery. And so this is something that we saw was happening from this company in Japan, and they were selling this all over the world. So we got this food, and we decided to take this food to the next level. And most of our customers that were using it at the time, and this was like, I'd say 10 years ago, it was mostly clownfish breeders that were using it. And the clownfish breeders were like, well, is there anything you can do to add more color, something that would give us more color? Make these ocellaris and these percula, these common clownfish, look more wild type. Because as we know, diet, a lot of animals rely on diet for pigmentation. Carotenoids are something that animals get from their diet that gives them pigmentation. Flamingos are a classic example. Flamingos get that coloration from their diet. It's not something that's, biologically, physiologically, genetically produced in their bodies. And so you have to supplement the diet of that animal. The same thing goes with some species of marine ornamentals. And so clownfish breeders were like, is there something you can add to it? And so we do what we call as top dressing. So we take the granule or the pellet, and we add this freshwater algae called Hematococcus fluvialis, which is rich in a red carotenoid called astaxanthin. And astaxanthin helps enhance and enrich the pigmentation of these animals. It also acts as an antioxidant. Carotenoids are really good for us too. If you look online at astaxanthin, there's actually human nutraceuticals that have astaxanthin in them. People put astaxanthin in their dog food. They'll put things like salmon oil that have it in there into dog food, into cat food, into foods of animals, because it's very good for health and pigmentation. So we did that, and clownfish breeders like, this is great. And then we decided, let's have it scientifically proven. So we sent off some different concentrations of astaxanthin to Virginia Tech. They did a study for us. They helped us optimize the astaxanthin content. And so that's what TDO is today. And then we just, we figured, it's very popular in aquaculture. Let's start letting other people know about it. Let's start getting it into the hands of hobbyists, into, marine aquarium hobbyists. And more and more people started using it and started really seeing, healthier fish. The pellets are a lot easier to deal with. This pellet is very nutrient dense. And so it's good for the fish. Because pellets have been stigmatized. Flake foods and pellets have been given a bad rap over the decades, and so this came along, and a lot of people were very impressed. They started incorporating it into the diet of their animals, and then other marine ornamental organizations and people breeding other fish started using it, and then freshwater people started using it. I use it on my freshwater tank, and we've got people breeding cichlids and angelfish and discus and goldfish and tetras and things like that, and bushy-nosed plecos, plecostomus, and the corydoras, the little catfish that you see in freshwater. They started using it, and they were like, "This is fantastic. It's also great for our brood stock. It really gets the females to produce a lot more eggs. That carotenoid gets into the eggs, and it's just been amazing." And the food speaks for itself. We just, put it in people's hands. We used to go to trade shows and just hand out hundreds of samples and just say, you got to try this. Here, give it a try. Use it for a couple of months and tell us what you think. And we didn't add any, sales pitches to it or flair to it or anything. We didn't need to. And people also like it because you can use it in an auto feeder. It's great for a quick, extra little bit of food every day if you're feeding frozen or or our liquid suspension feeds. You know, on top of all those things, it's easy to throw in a good high quality pellet into the tank, and also people really love the size variations of that of TDO. You know, because you can buy very small granules of TDO in what we call the B sizes. So B1 and B2 are very small sizes. So people, let's say people getting mandarins and small fish out of aquaculture can use this very small granule to get those fish to eat. Then they start growing, and then you can go buy the TDO extra small. And then when they get bigger, you can buy the TDO small. And for people with big fish, big tangs and angelfish, you can get the TDO large. And you can offer your fish different size pellets. And so you can have small fish eating the small granules and big fish eating the extruded pellets. And so it added in, you know, it gave people more tools, more variety, more diversity to work with. So yeah, if anybody of you are listening, you haven't tried TDO yet, you know, reach out to us. You know, you can ask us questions or just give it a try. It's one of those dry feeds that's available online because not a lot of stores carry it yet. They're starting to pick it up. Cracking into the flake and pellet food market was really hard because there are a lot of pelleted and flake foods out there. I mean, there are some companies that have, you know, 15 to 20 different kinds of pellets that for, you know, cichlids and freshwater, marine, and this and that. And so we tend to just, you know, just sell TDO as an all-purpose dry food for a lot of different freshwater and saltwater fish and invertebrates. You know, you've got your cleaner shrimp will eat TDO, no problem. And, you know, we have people feeding it to the most bizarre animals. I've seen people feed it to stingrays and garden eels and axolotls and poison dart frogs and salamanders. And I just, we've been blown away. I know people that have fed it to chickens and the yolk turns red. And they're like, it's got to be good. It's chock full of those carotenoids, which are really good for the human body, and antioxidants are excellent for your cells in your body. So yeah, TDO is just one of those things that, you know, we developed and kind of stumbled upon, and it's just blossomed into something we had no idea. And we only have one guy making the TDO. We have one employee that makes TDO for the whole world, and he's, you know, I'm doing my best to keep him busy. Yeah, that's TDO, you know, not just for marine fish, but for many other things. Don't hold back.
And that's important because, you know, I mean, you know, for those, I mean, I feed a lot of frozen, but, you know, you don't always have time. You know, you don't always have time. You're on the go, you're on the run. You got to thaw it, you got to strain it, you got to rinse it out and all that. So yeah, a pellet like TDO is a great option when you're on the run, just to throw in the tank and go. Or if you're going away for the weekend or you're going on vacation, you know, it's something you can put in an auto feeder, and you can have confidence that your fish are still getting good nutrition while you're away on vacation. So yeah, I always would do usually 2 meals at least a day. One would be frozen, one would probably be TDO, you know, a good pellet food, you know, for balance. So that's excellent.
And the other thing I would recommend, and a lot of people ask this, is it floating? Is it sinking? These are some, you know, important questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is a floating like, so the granule, so the TDO small, so from TDO medium and large, that's an extruded pellet, and it has somewhat of a smooth surface, so that will sink. You know, it doesn't sink like a rock would sink, but it does sink. You know, it's negatively buoyant, and so people need to know that. The granules, on the other hand, so anything smaller than TDO small, so TDO small, extra small, B2, B1, A, and then you get into the A's. Those all float. They tend to float because they have a different structure. They're granules is what we call them. So they have a different structure, and they tend to trap air in these little, you know, imperfections in the granule. And so what people will do to avoid that food going over the overflow into the filter sock, the waste, is just use a feeding ring. Feeding rings are super cheap. Doesn't, you know, as long as you've got something that the food, you know, if it's an auto feeder, the food just goes right over the feeding ring, and then the fish come up. And also, you know, it's a cool place for fish to kind of, you know, that's where they get fed. They know that, you know, they all come up there. And if you've got fish that are pretty ravenous for TDO, once they start hitting that TDO and agitating the water surface, the granules just start going boom right right into the water. And if you've got a lot of current, let's say you've got a reef tank with a lot of movement, water flow, and you've got, SPS corals and things that need that, the TDO typically won't just float on the surface and go down the overflow, because there's just too much surface agitation and too much current. So those are really good questions that we always get. And so I'm glad that I was able to address that here today.
Yeah, those are excellent tips for, when you're on vacation and you want to make sure that the pellets don't go into the overflow, to use. So excellent. So let's talk about, I know we talked a little bit about this before, but more people are wanting to try their hand at breeding marine fish, not just clownfish. Some people are trying to breed pseudochromis and other species. So what products do you all sell that can help the amateur hobbyist who wants to, try breeding marine fish?
Yeah, last year, a lot of people were stuck at home and their clownfish were spawning and they were wondering how to do this. And I think I was on the phone at least 3 or 4 times a week for months, kind of talking people through this whole process. And typically what I do is I try to talk them out of it, because what a lot of people don't realize is, let's say you've got Ocellaris and they laid down a 300 egg spawn and 100% fertilization, very robust larvae. Let's say you're super successful, and let's say you get through 200, successfully. You got to have a plan on what you're going to do with those 200. And so that, I always tell people that, like, have a plan. If you have a local fish store and they're willing to just take those fish from you, that's awesome. As long as your fish are healthy, as long as they don't have any infections that you could potentially give to that store or to another hobbyist, plan ahead, have that plan in place. Because 200 fish, that's a heck of a lot of clownfish, and you got to find homes for them. So that's always something that people need to keep in mind. But when it comes to other species, there are fish, marine ornamentals that are very common in the hobby that you would have no problem selling to a local fish store or to hobbyists. As long as you practice and learn how to ship fish. That can be pretty tricky and a little bit stressful. So that's something else to think about. If you're going to ship them, if you have local sources that you can drive them to, that's excellent. But yeah, people typically, it's good to kind of, get your hands wet with clownfish. They are one of the easier fish to get to spawn and to raise larvae and be successful. And also you only have to use rotifers on clownfish. It's an easier live feed organism to work with versus copepods. So I would say that, anybody that's got, let's say you've got clownfish spawning in your tank, and what's crazy is, that pair, as long as you're consistent and they're well fed and their environment remains, stable, those fish will spawn for 20 to 30 years. And so you will have no shortage of spawns to attempt this with. Just keep that in mind. If they're new, if they're spawning just now for the first time, don't touch those eggs. Usually the fertilization rates are low. The larvae aren't as robust. And when I worked at oceans, reefs, and aquariums in Florida breeding clownfish, we would typically just let the first couple of spawns go. And typically what the pair will do is they'll eat them, or the larvae will hatch and just go to your overflow and go into your sump and get taken out by your filtration, or they'll just get eaten by corals and other fish. That's typically what happens when they hatch. So with those things in mind, so what I did was I created a page on our website called Clownfish 101, and it is somewhat of an informative page where I kind of separated out rotifer culture and how do I, what do I do if my clownfish spawn? How do I get the larvae? What do I do with the larvae? How do I capture them? How do I, do the larva rearing tank? How do I feed the rotifers, take care of waste, add things like algae to the tank? And how do I, wean them off of live feeds and grow them out and get them ready to sell to market? So I kind of broke all these things down, all these common questions that we got throughout the years, and created kind of this FAQ that's compartmentalized into those subjects. So I would highly recommend you take a look at that on top of what I'm going to say now. But typically, you've really got to get good at culturing rotifers if you're going to do this. They are a great live feed organism. You're basically, what you're doing is you're feeding them phytoplankton, and we sell a phytoplankton blend that has a very good lipid enrichment component. It also has an ammonia neutralizer and a pH buffer. This product is called RG Complete. And this is kind of like what we call the training wheels of our phytoplankton products. It's more dilute and it's easier to work with, and you can still grow a lot of rotifers with this phytoplankton blend. And again, the algae is not alive, and this is a refrigerated product. And so we offer that product for you to feed to the rotifers. We offer the rotifers. We offer live rotifers. And we also offer the equipment to grow them. We have a couple of systems, and one of them is called the Roadie Clean filter. It was invented by my good friend Ben Roman. He owns a company called Atomic Aquaculture in Texas, and he helped me design this filter. It's a hang on the back filter, and basically it hangs on a 5-gallon bucket, and it works just like a hang on the back filter, like any garden variety aquarium filter. And the rotifers will get sucked up into this filter. They get sucked up through the pump, and it doesn't kill them, and they get pushed right back into the bucket. And it has a filter insert that has this filter floss, which is very similar to the mechanical filter floss that we use in aquariums to accumulate waste. And so this material just accumulates the rotifer waste, because rotifer waste is the biggest killer of a rotifer culture. These animals reproduce themselves asexually. So they're all females. When they're happy and healthy, they're all females, and they're just cloning themselves, creating clones nonstop. They can double their density every 24 hours as long as the conditions are clean and they're well fed. They can get very dense, and you can imagine a lot of these animals are producing a lot of waste, and that waste can suddenly just start causing problems with the culture. Ammonia, we all know about ammonia. Ammonia can cause problems with rotifers. They're not super sensitive to it, but with enough of it, it affects reproduction that eventually they start dying. And once they start dying, it just starts getting worse and worse and worse. And then they what we call crash or a collapse, the culture crash. And so this filter helps to kind of export that waste every day, pull that filter floss out, spray all the gunk off of the floss, all the rotifer poo and all the dead rotifers, and then put that floss right back in and feed the algae to the system a couple times a day. And we have instructions for all of this on our website. And we have instructions on how to harvest them and how to feed them to a larval rearing tank. But rotifers, basically, if you're gonna do this, I would highly recommend you start culturing rotifers. And what you can do with the rotifers in the meantime, as you're culturing them and harvesting them, is you can take the extra rotifers and feed them to your reef tank. You can feed them, if fish will eat them. Chromis and Anthias will gladly eat rotifers. These are planktivores, very small-mouthed fish, and they will gladly consume these animals. SPS corals will consume rotifers, no problem. And so it's kind of cool to be able to offer a live feed organism to your corals. And in fact, some people culture rotifers purely for that purpose. And one thing to keep in mind is a rotifer will not colonize your reef tank. They're not set up to survive in that kind of situation. They are filter feeders, so they need food to be in the water constantly. They're very much like an NPS coral that needs to be fed very, very often. You can't have a super pristine tank that has nothing in the water column for rotifers and animals like NPS corals and bivalves that need to eat constantly. And so that's something to keep in mind. Now, there is a possibility that they will live in a refugium. Some people have asked that. They're like, well, if I feed my phytoplankton in my refugium a couple times a day and the refuge is somewhat dirty, will they do fine? And it's possible. It's quite possible. What's interesting is in a culture, you're heavily aerating the culture. So the rotifers are tumbling around, they're homogenized, they're in the water column, and they're reproducing themselves. And that also helps to oxygenate the culture. But in a very relaxed, calm environment, what these animals do is they have this tendency, this proclivity to attach to surfaces. They have what looks like a tail, but it's actually a foot. And that foot excretes, at the tip of the foot, they excrete an adhesive. And we think this is like a polysaccharide or something. They this adhesive to attach to surfaces, because a lot of rotifers are colonial. They'll attach to a surface and hang out next to each other. And then they'll just grab whatever's in the water. And rotifer, in Latin means wheel bearer. And what they have are these cilia at the top, at the corona, at the crown of their body, and the cilia are constantly doing this. And it kind of looks like it looks like a wheel, looks like a couple of wheels, and that's their way of getting food into their body and then down into their mouth. And they have inside of their body, they have what's called a mastax, and it's these two. They look like fists. So as the bacteria, the phytoplankton come into the body, they're grinding this stuff up, and then it goes into their gut, and then they digest it, and so on. And there are incredible videos on YouTube. You can see this actually happening under the microscope. People have done some amazing videos on this. So yeah, check that out. Go to YouTube, type in Rotifer, Rotifer, and you'll see some pretty epic stuff. And in fact, just recently, and I think it was in Siberia, they thawed out. They found some thawed rotifers. It was like just these rotifers that had been frozen up in the tundra for a long time, and they hatched, and they came back to life. And this is what's really cool about rotifers is that when the environment starts to decline, environmental conditions start to decline, this is slowly, the female will produce a male. And that male has no digestive system. He will sexually reproduce with the female, and then he basically starves to death. He just sexually reproduces with as many females as he can. He starves to death and dies. And then that female produces what is called a resting egg. So some of you may be familiar with brine shrimp. When you buy dried brine shrimp eggs, they're encysted. They're inside of like a shell, a coating. And so rotifers will do that same thing. That egg will settle into that system, and hundreds and thousands of years can go by. And when the system improves, they hatch and they're off and running. And it's just remarkable. And so that's, there are a lot of rotifer species on the planet. They're in a lot of different environments. They're in forests, they're in lakes and streams and the ocean, and some of them are parasitic, and many of them are freshwater. And the one we work with is euryhaline, so it can tolerate a wide range of salinities. And so a lot of people are using it also in freshwater. They're breeding freshwater fish with this rotifer, because a lot of freshwater fish larvae can handle a little bit of salinity. And so, yeah, rotifers are where it's at for getting getting things going with breeding clownfish. And once you've got some clownfish bred, and then you're ready, then you understand the process, then you have a good idea of what it takes, and then you can start working with other fish that aren't very commonly produced. Like you mentioned, chromis. It'd be great if more people were doing other damsels. There's wrasses, and there's all kinds of cardinal fish, all kinds of fish out there that can be worked with. Gobies, a lot of different goby species, and blennies, and dotty backs and things like that. So rotifers work for many of those, but some of the fish that are being bred, copepods are where it's at, and that's a next level organism to deal with. But if you have any questions about copepod culture, just let me know. I've been doing it for nearly 20 years now, and they're fascinating animals for sure, and they're much different than a rotifer by a lot. So yeah, that's those are some of the things I recommend amateurs, first-time breeders really think about.
So at what point could you wean the baby fish from rotifers onto TDO to make life easier?
Absolutely, that's a good question. It's fascinating because a lot of clownfish breeders used to use Artemia, brine shrimp. They used to hatch baby brine shrimp and feed baby brine shrimp after the rotifer or on top of the rotifer, at the same time, and then introduce a weaning feed like TDO, a dry feed. But with TDO, you can skip the Artemia. You don't have to use brine shrimp. And brine shrimp can be dirty. They can have bacteria. They are somewhat difficult to digest. There are some problems with Artemia. They're not terrible, but there can be some problems. So what typically a lot of the clownfish breeders that are working with Ocellaris and Percula, the common clownfish that we see in the hobby, they're introducing the TDO-A, which is the 75 to 250 micron powdered food. They're introducing that before metamorphosis. We're talking like day 4 or 5. And then, a few days later, they start to go through metamorphosis and start getting pigmentation, and their structure changes. And it's happening really early on. And then by like day 10 to 14, some of these breeders are on to dry feed only, and they're done with the rotifers. And for For a breeder, and they all know this, if you know that once you get your animals off of live feeds, it's a game changer. It is just so much easier. And then you can add in, other things like our Tigger Feast, our dead Tigger pods and fish eggs, and get them onto all kinds of other things, and really just, grow them fast and then get them out the door. And so that's, yeah, it's remarkable how early on these fish will take to a granulated powdered food that looks nothing like a live feed organism. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, that's really useful because I mean, it's been 20, 30 years ago. I first started breeding clownfish. I did it for a couple of years, and
Oh, cool.
yeah, culturing the rotifers, that was the most challenging part for me. I think even for a while I was ordering them and having them shipped to me, and the cost of it. I was like, so knowing that you can start to transition them to the TDO that's really helpful because that makes it more practical to attempt breeding, I think.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, back in the day, some people would have them on live feed organisms for like 3 weeks
yep.
or a month, and that is a nightmare, especially if you're working with brine shrimp, because brine shrimp, you either have to feed them as soon as they hatch, or if they go into their next stage of development, you have to enrich that animal because the lipids deplete very rapidly. And lipids, as we know in aquaculture, are very important to larval finfish development. And that's why I mentioned that in our RG Complete, that lipid enrichment component gets into the rotifer. And these are fatty acids. These are like omega-3 fatty acids and things that are incredibly important for cell membranes and their precursors. And there's all kinds of stuff that they are part of. They're in the brains and the eyes of animals and things like that. And so these fatty acids are very important. They have to be in the rotifer. They have to be in the rotifer's tissue, and that has to be passed on to the larval fish. And those are just some really big parts of larval finfish development.
Okay. So kind of switching gears. So are there any new products that are coming out that you can kind of tell us about or things you all have in development?
Yeah, there's a new copepod. It's going to be our first frozen product. It's a 500 micron cyclopoid copepod, so it's in the same order of copepods as our Apex pods, which is one of our live copepods that people inoculate reef tanks with. And this is going to be big in the fish aquaculture world as a replacement diet for Artemia. Because what we're doing is we're looking ahead at Artemia, and things are going to get really bad for Artemia globally. Their environments are shifting. You're going to see fewer Artemia in aquaculture and in the hobby. And so we have this copepod that we're getting from Japan, and it's going to replace Artemia as part of the diet for freshwater fish and saltwater fish. And so we're looking to come out with a liquid suspension form of this copepod for the hobby, for people that are keeping NPS corals and SPS and LPS corals that want to add a smaller copepod to the diet of their animals. And so this copepod is essentially similar in size to our fish egg, our roe, which is about 700 microns, so 0.7 millimeters. And so that's something that we're looking to do. I'm also looking to grow some macroalgae, to get back into macroalgae and grow Chetomorpha. A lot of people like to have Chetomorpha in their refugiums, and it also makes a great habitat for things like amphipods and copepods. And so that's something I'm looking to produce on a massive scale. I used to grow Gracilaria pacifica for reed mariculture, which is a red macroalgae, and a lot of people loved that. They would feed it to their yellow tangs and rabbit fish and things like that. And a lot of acanthrurids love macroalgae. We stopped carrying that product because it really just didn't make sense in a pet store. Sitting on a shelf in a pet store would go bad. And it definitely didn't survive in a refugium. It's just the wrong kind of macroalgae. But Chetomorpha is something that I want to do for sure. And then we also potentially want to grow our own brine shrimp and sell live brine shrimp to stores and hobbyists. Fully enriched, grown on our phytoplankton, enriched with our high lipid emulsion products, and just something that a store can sell to their customers or just use it in house. So those are a couple of things we're looking at as far as the hobby goes.
Okay. So one last question. So, in today's day and age, it's getting harder and harder to find products. Sometimes you go to local fish stores and availability isn't what it used to be, pre-COVID. So someone watching this video is like, they're like, I want to buy some of your products. Where are the best places or, for them to find and buy your products?
Yes, that's a very good question. We do have a number of fish stores that carry us throughout the United States and Canada. We're also in Southeast Asia and now in Bangladesh, which is really cool. But as far as the U.S. goes or North America, yeah, we're in local fish stores, but we're not in every single one. And so a lot of people tend to buy directly from us online. We just set up a brand new website with Shopify. So we made it a lot easier for people to buy, a lot easier for people to get information on our products. And, let's say you've got a tang and you want to know what it eats for our products. So we have a page on tangs. And so we do have what we call our subscription programs. The only problem with buying online is you will pay for shipping. You absolutely have to pay for shipping because these are perishable items. There's just no way to make shipping free unless, of course, we raise the price on all the products, and then nothing's free. Nothing is free. Somebody's losing money when they say free shipping. There's money being lost somewhere, but being made with other products.
Because you all ship like with ice packs?
So yes, we ship in insulated boxes with ice packs, and we ship all year round. And in the summer, we keep track of regional temperatures, and so when things get really hot, we just add more ice. And we ship routinely all year round. The only thing that ever messes up our shipping process is the shipper themselves.
Right.
And FedEx and UPS and a lot of these shippers have had a lot of troubles lately. Ever since the big winter storms that happened in Texas, things have just been really difficult with shipping products. But we ship FedEx. We will, if you're desperate, we'll ship it overnight. It's really expensive. But we typically ship FedEx second day, or with the TDO and the Rotifer equipment and our sieve, we ship that FedEx ground because it's not perishable. But yeah, FedEx second day is what we typically ship with. And if you set up a subscription plan, the shipping cost can go from like $40 down to $20, and then it's always $20. Now, you have other companies that are the majority of their business is done online. So saltwateraquarium.com, Alyssa Seahorse Savvy. There are some stores that also sell us online. You can find our products with them as well. And we do have, there'll be a big announcement coming up on another big online seller that's going to be carrying our products. And we look forward to announcing that soon. And so, we've always wanted people to have access to our products, and while not competing with our stores. And so, we're not necessarily competing with the stores because we never sell below our minimum price. We never do sales. And we charge for shipping. You go to a local fish store, you're not going to have to pay $20 for the bottle of tiger pods that you're buying, and an extra $20. And so if you have a store that is a good store, and you want them to carry our products, let me know. Just reach out to us. There's a number of ways to reach out to us. I'm on Facebook. I'm very, very responsive on Facebook, on Instagram. You can check out my email, chad@reedmariculture.com. And I'm very responsive with our customer base. I really like interacting with them. And so yes, you can find us in a number of different ways for sure.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll include links in the comment section to your website and some of the other things we talked about, like your Clownfish 101. I'll include links and everything for that. So sounds like local fish shop is the best place to buy your products. If your local fish shop doesn't carry the products, encourage them to carry Reef Nutrition products. But if all else fails, you can find your products online and on your website or through an online reseller.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I just want to put that out there. We're on the Humble Fish and Reef community, and I really love the communities and being a part of those forums and really helping to educate people and give people advice or information on what we do and our products. So yeah, make sure to jump on there too and find me there.
Yeah. If you want to talk to Chad, he's on my forum. You can you guys have your own sub forum for Reef Nutrition. You can find them there. So anything else you want to discuss, or you want to wrap it up?
The other than that, I mean, trade shows have turned back on, so I'm starting to get back into the trade show scene. We have a show coming up here, Silicon Valley Coral Farmers Market in September. And then we're going to be in Chicago. Well, we're going to be in Schaumburg, which is one of the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And that's October 16th and 17th. And I will have a big old booth right there at that show. And so if you live in the Midwest and want to swing by the booth, please come and see me. And sometimes we bring freebies to these trade shows, so you'll have to check that out as well. And then next year, if all things continue the way they're going, and they allow trade shows to happen, we'll be at a variety of places all throughout the United States. So we like to, at the beginning of the year, I like to announce which trade shows we're doing for the year. And so keep an eye out for that in January, and then plan ahead. These trade shows are unbelievable. The variety of corals, and you get to touch base with the manufacturers and the vendors. It's an experience. It's a very unique experience. It's unlike anything you'll ever imagine when it comes to this hobby. So I highly recommend it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Chad, thank you very much for allowing us to do this interview, and we'll see you on the forum.
Right on. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you for watching this video. See links in the comments section for more detailed information, and join us on my forum to learn more about reef nutrition and all saltwater aquarium related topics.